Malcolm Nicolson is an international educator, having worked in schools in the UK, the Bahamas, Thailand, and India. He is the head of school at Trinity International School in Hyderabad, India. He is best known for his 8 years working for the IB, International Baccalaureate, in the UK and the Netherlands. Malcolm led the first ever review and revision of an IB program, the Middle Years Program, MYP, incorporating concepts, context, skills, and e-assessment. Having revamped the MYP, he directed the development of the IB Diploma Program, adding a pedagogical approach and examining workload, stress, and curriculum flexibility. He has since guided schools in over 20 countries and developed a broad understanding of what works in classrooms as well as what doesn't. Malcolm has always also run his own consultancy company, IMYC Education, for the last 5 years, and has learned a great deal that he's looking forward to using that experience in his new school context. So with that, I'd like to welcome Malcolm. Malcolm, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us today. It's an absolute pleasure. Yeah, pleasure to meet you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in. And we have lots of questions to ask you. And first, we always like to start with is a backstory. We want to know what led you into education and how did your interests become focused on international curriculum education or development?
Well, actually, when you first actually suggested that you were going to ask me that, it took me quite a while to remember. It was really quite an interesting activity for me to try and think back. I think it goes back to when I was about 14 or 15 years old, and I was going through the bronze and then the silver and then the gold Duke of Edinburgh Award schemes, eventually working on to the gold award itself. It's known as the International Youth Award in many countries outside the UK. And for that, you have to do a form of service. And what I was doing was following my passion for ecological matters. And I was working at Teesmouth Field Centre, which is as glamorous as it sounds. It's a field centre right next to Hartlepool Nuclear Power Station and based around a lot of post-industrial wasteland on Teesside in the northeast of England. And as part of that, I started taking groups of Sunday school, scouts, guides, etc., on walking tours of the area, because there's a lot of interesting wildlife amongst the post-industrial dereliction. And I realized I really enjoyed it. I loved taking other young people out and describing and sharing with them my passion for ecology, and something clicked. So when I went to university and did an ecological sciences degree, afterwards the logical thing to do was to become a teacher, because I'd already got a thirst for it. I realized this is what I liked doing, and I thought I was quite good at it. So I became a teacher, obviously a science teacher, because that involved the biology and the ecological sciences. But then combine that with probably a family history. My father spent most of the 1960s working in southern and central Africa, which resulted in me being born in Zambia in around about then. And that has been part of my family backstory, is a love of traveling and a love of exploring other places. And so it seemed natural to me, after a few years working in the UK as a teacher, to explore opportunities overseas. And as you said earlier, I went from the UK to the Bahamas, loved it, and grew as a person, grew as a teacher, then on to Thailand, which again changed me as a person, enjoyed the culture and so on. And so I've experienced, Bahamas, Thailand, back to UK, Netherlands. And you learn so much by being in these different places. But what I really learned, and now in India, of course, right now, but what I really found was that being able to compare the state system that I'd been in the UK with the international systems I enjoyed in the Bahamas and Thailand. In Thailand, it was within the IB programs. In the Bahamas, it wasn't. Was the fact that there's so much more is possible, and that as much as we read about what works best in the classroom, you sometimes find that when you're having to follow a particular national system, that you know what is right because you've read what is right, but you can't do that because of the huge amount of accountability towards high stakes assessment and issues like that. So I thought there's a bigger, brighter world to be addressed here. And I got more and more interested in the idea of the design of international curriculum, because the world is your oyster, because there's less prescription, less worshipping at the altar of high stakes assessment, and more ability to do what you know is right. And that's what drew me in eventually to working as a vice principal in Thailand, where I was responsible for developing curriculum across the school, and then onto the IB, where I worked in curriculum development. So it was the realization that there is something more we can do that maybe governments are not letting us do.
Wow, you have a very extensive background with your travel. I'm sure that has definitely highlighted the concept of international curriculum, and will continue to do so, I'm sure.
And absolutely, and I reflect on this, and I know I was changed as a person by living in the Bahamas and what I gained from the culture there. And in Thailand, I certainly became a more patient, tolerant human being. I had a greater appreciation for others. I certainly became more able to deal with change and to deal with disappointment. And my penrai doesn't matter. Let's just get on with things. And I took on a lot of the traits of many of my Thai colleagues and friends, which I think is of great benefit to me personally, because I probably wasn't as pleasant a person then as you find in front of you right now, in my opinion.
So definitely travel can shape you, that's for sure.
Oh, yes.
So in your curriculum development experience, what do you see are the essential ingredients to an outstanding curriculum?
It's a good point. And I think a lot of my views on that are shaped by people I've worked with and people I've read. And one of the biggest influences on my career is Lynn Erickson. She's written many, many books on concept-based teaching and learning. And for some time, Lynn has been a good friend and a mentor at many levels. She's an amazing person, and her books are well worth a look if you're interested. And she talks about how we've got to move from a two-dimensional to a three-dimensional curriculum. In other words, moving away from purely knowledge-based and skills. Here's the knowledge, this is the content, let's get it rammed down the throats of the students so that we can get them tested at a certain point in time on that content or knowledge. And of course, alongside the knowledge will be certain skills that must be taught in order for the students to access that knowledge. What she suggests is moving from that 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions by bringing in conceptual understanding, which is something, of course, that the IMYC actually does very successfully, is to bring in the idea of that big idea, the big picture, which almost answers the why am I doing it point. So I think for me, you've got to have the skills, you've got to have knowledge, because you can't get to that conceptual understanding if you don't have the knowledge. But the third and big part of it is to bring in the idea of working for deep understanding. But I think even more broadly than that, it's what I said before about the why. How can we use concepts? And I would argue that concepts must be taught within some kind of a context. I think, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals provide fantastic contexts for learning, a real life context that puts that concept in a situation. So I think purpose, meaning, context, the why are also really important, which live alongside the conceptual understanding. I think also, if we're looking at the best design of curriculum, we've got to move along also from thinking that curriculum is just about what is written and therefore what is taught. Mm-hmm. Thinking back to when I was a baby teacher, hundreds of years ago, I would go into my lessons with lots and lots of notes. And my main objective was to get all my notes into their books. And that's what I did. And therefore, in my opinion at that time, the students had learned. And if they didn't then demonstrate at some point that they had learned it, then it was most certainly their fault. I think we've all moved on a long way since then, and we realised that there've got to be different pedagogical approaches, not an easy word to say. And so what I believe is that curriculum is more than that written component, but it must also incorporate the pedagogical component. I believe that an inquiry-based approach will support the conceptual understanding. It will give students the opportunity to practice and demonstrate the skills acquisition and an opportunity to develop skills around teamwork, group work, collaboration, all the research skills and so on, and recording skills that are so important in the IMYC. I think that comes through inquiry. So for me, curriculum is about what's the written curriculum, the taught curriculum or the pedagogical approach, how it's taught is really important, and then how it's assessed and how students have the opportunity to demonstrate their understanding. I think they work together. So moving away from the idea that curriculum is just the written, but it must be the written, the pedagogy, and the assessed curriculum. And that's what I think is the hallmark of an excellent international education.
Mm. And I love your part about, from your mentor, going from a 2D to a 3D. It's a great image. It's a great metaphor to think about.
And her books are really fabulous, and she has some great diagrams that she uses that really show what she means. Just very simple diagram using a two-dimensional wall, then becoming a three-dimensional shape. Also, Lynn has published her idea of what the structure of knowledge is, with the foundations being the knowledge or the content, leading up to, that's the foundations of the house, leading up towards topics and then conceptual understanding. So a lot of visuals that really help too.
Oh, that's great. Well, in the International Middle Years Curriculum, or the IMYC, we have something called the Process to Facilitate Learning. And this process is repeated many times throughout an academic year, providing familiarity and routine to a student's learning journey. So with the process is a mini cycle of research, record, and reflection. And that can be repeated several times for student learning. So based on your work and experience, what are some of the best ways for students to research and record their learning? And why is reflection an important part of the learning process?
Okay, I think my first comment there is it's really good that IMYC has included this routine, because when things become routine, it means that they can focus on what they're learning and not worry about what's going on around and how. So I think it's a great idea to do that. I think my first and probably biggest point here is that the skills of recording and reflecting must be taught. Many times you will have teachers who might assume that students have actually developed skills previously or have miraculously been born with them. Well, these skills must be taught. I know my son, for example, was given a piece of so-called inquiry where he had to go away and research the life of the Duke of Normandy. And as I helped my son, I realized he did not know how to search other than go into Google, click on Wikipedia, copy and paste and print. And if you haven't taught a young person how to research and then record what they've researched, then that's what happens. So I think the main point for me is one must actually deliberately and explicitly teach the skills, how to conduct a search, how to use a search engine, how to locate information, how to sift through the information to work out what's relevant. Then what do you do with the information when you've found it? Do students know how to paraphrase or summarize? I think the biggest one for me in terms of what to do with this is to teach students a range of graphic organizers. I know for me, my own personal style is I use bullet points. That's my favorite one. I've also enjoyed using mind maps in my time, but I know that there's the fishbone and there's many other graphic organizers. I think the thing is that one should be teaching students a range of different graphic organizers so that they eventually work out which works best for them and in which circumstance. So my big push here was ensure that these are taught, and then students will find which graphic organizer works for them. Color coding schemes are very, very helpful. Get into the habit of reviewing notes and records that they keep after the lesson, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 2 weeks later, so that it then becomes embedded in the long-term memory. But again, it's about students finding out what works best for them. Now, as for reflection, reflection is absolutely crucial. I think probably most teachers have found this through experience, is that reflective process helps learners to embed the new knowledge into their longer term memory. So it's crucial for developing understandings, retaining knowledge. Memorizing isn't a dirty word in education. In some fields it is, but it helps them to remember what's important. And also reflection helps, in many cases, students to connect what they've learned to prior learning so that they can actually make those connections and hang hooks, if you like, onto what they've done before. But I think also beyond improving what they know, understand, and can remember, reflection can help the learner to become a better learner, because reflection isn't just about what we did or how much fun we had. You know, if you haven't taught a student how to reflect, sometimes you get, well, I enjoyed that because we did an experiment, or that was a fun lesson because I worked with my best friend, Bob. So, you know, you get this kind of very shallow thing. But if you actually teach students reflection, and it is a teachable set of skills, then the students will get more out of it and focus on reflection around what was learned, also about how it was learned, so process reflection. How did you succeed? Where didn't you succeed? How could you do it better? So that it's helping students to become a better learner. So they're not just reflecting on what they learned, but how they learned it and how they feel about it as well. It's really useful to have affective reflections that students go through what, how, and how did you feel? I think put all that together and it really helps. And my final point on reflection is, I think really great set of tools. Again, we like routines. Routines are good. The Harvard Project Zero visible thinking routines are fantastic. I know many teachers who might be watching this will be using them already, but you've got ones for reflection, for analysis, for synthesis, for all sorts of thinking skills and research skills. And I would very frequently turn to those where, again, when you name that skill that you want to practice, then it becomes routine and students can always reach for that protocol or that routine in the future.
Yeah, that's great. And I love what you said about the reflection being what, how, and how do you feel? I mean, those are great. And definitely what you said about, you know, bringing in the Harvard visible learning is a wonderful reflection tool. So great.
Yeah, they're absolutely fantastic. I thoroughly recommend them.
Yeah. So you have been a big proponent of student voice, choice, and ownership in the classroom. What does that scenario look and feel like? And can you tell us a success story or an example of how they were implemented in education?
Yeah, I think, again, going back to what I said about earlier, sometimes if you're in a particular educational system, you sense that when the learners have no opportunity to have an input into what they're learning or how they're learning or where they're learning, then it really hits motivation. It can be horribly demotivating. The only thing that a learner in many schools can actually control is the effort that they put in. That's the only thing they have control over. And no wonder sometimes that there is less effort applied when they feel like education is being done to them rather than with them. So I think that voice, choice, and ownership or agency is absolutely crucial to support engagement, mental health, and just keep the intrinsic motivation going. So students should be able to have a say in what is being learned. you know, when you're setting the big ideas and the essential questions, guiding questions in a unit, to what extent does one ask the learners, what questions do you have? How would you like to address this? So that if they have particular interests, then they can bring it in. You know, if you're looking at conflict as an example of a particular concept, then, you know, your selection of conflicts may actually not hit the mark with what that actual group is interested in. But if you actually ask them which conflicts they're interested in, then you might learn something and they might be more engaged, as one example. So you can be asking students what they want to be learning about, but also where. Do they all need to be seated in the same places, in the same routines? Do some students need to sit on their own? Do some want to work in groups? Is that a good choice? Sometimes it's better not to give a choice, but many times it is. And I'm not saying it's a free-for-all, definitely not. There does need to be structure. We do need to move along as we, as educators, demand. But if there is not an ability for the learners to at least set some of the agenda, then they will be turned off. And the final part of that is the assessment. You know, how does one particular learner best demonstrate their understanding of a particular concept or their application of a particular skill? Everyone has a different way of wanting to do it. I might choose to demonstrate my understanding of Newton's laws of motion through an essay. Another student might choose to actually design an experiment and film himself or herself conducting that experiment. Another person might like to create a podcast. I think that the kind of activities that you see at the end of units in the IMYC are a wonderful example of that in action, where students might choose to demonstrate their understanding of a particular big idea in their own way, using media, for example. So I think that really works. And quite recently, I've been working with a group of schools in Turkey, and we were working on the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And it was quite a broad challenge, and this is for 15, 16-year-old learners. The idea being, we've got the SDGs. Which one are you most passionate about? So there's the choice. That they were limited in that it has to be an SDG, but they could choose any one of the 17. So there's no getting away from the SDGs, right? So there's some direction from the teacher, but it had to be one of them. So they would choose, and many chose, as you can imagine, life below water, life on land, climate action, and gender equality. Really, really rich areas, and the students were clearly passionate. And the idea was that, like with any good inquiry, that they were going to inquire, find out what was going on, and find out what the world needed, and then it would result in an action. And any really good inquiry will result in some form of an action, whether it's a change in your own behavior or something you've done more widely for your community, your school, or the world. And in this case, given this freedom to explore, some of the students came up with astonishing results. And I've recently been looking at the videos that they produced. One boy, he created a kids' cartoon book about life below water and the impact of plastic in the oceans. And he did it on his computer. It was fully cartoon, and he did it in English, and he distributed it to primary schools. It was an unbelievable piece of work, and that was his passion. He was driven because he had ownership over it. A girl designed a course for teaching, and she went to local primary schools and taught students about gender equality. Incredible. Other students chose to do things like pamphlets, which they handed out at school and so on. There was a wide variety. Some were better than others. Some students showed more motivation than others. Some showed better technological skills than others. Fine. But all the students had fun, and they all did something that they would have never done before without this opportunity. And they've all done an action now, or completed an action that could help the local environment or the local community in some way. So that's one example of where I've seen it working recently, and it's absolutely inspiring.
And I love what you say, it's so true that education, is how you said it, is education just put onto to a child, to a student, instead of coming from them. And
Yeah.
I think the value of having the choice and the challenge and that voice and ownership is essential.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not easy for a teacher to lose control, if you like. But as you know, as Elsa told us, let it go, let it go.
True words, never been spoken, ever been spoken. So assessment of learning is also a very big topic in education, and you've mentioned it. And with your experience and background, I know this is an area you've researched and you've reflected upon. So there is a common question put forth in education. Do we assess what we value, or do we value what we assess? Which do you think is the best answer to this question, and what is your reasoning behind it?
Well, I think what we're doing at the moment is that right now, we value what we assess, right? That's it. We value what we assess because university grades, A levels, IB diploma, college boards, advanced placement, all these different courses put on that pressure towards age 16 and age 18. You've got to get the grades. You've got to get the grades. So it's all about how can we assess in the easiest, most reliable fashion. What we then have is a negative backwash on curriculum, which becomes too focused on what is easy to assess, in my opinion. What is easy to assess is knowledge. And if we want to be really reliable, then a whole load of multiple choice questions that can be marked by a computer is the most reliable. And there are exam boards that rely on this, massive banks of multiple choice questions, hundreds of them. And is that good for the student? Is that forcing a really positive impact on a rich curriculum involving skills, knowledge, and understanding? No, it's forcing a prescription of knowledge that can then be more easily assessed. And I think all of the exam boards that I'm aware of are guilty of this narrowing of curriculum because we value what we assess. I believe it would be better if we were able to move to a situation where we assess what we value. And now we value things like teamwork, collaboration, problem solving, entrepreneurship, communication, those kind of ideas, those skills are what we value these days. You look on any of those LinkedIn top 10 lists, what the top 10 skills required for American recruiters or for Malaysian universities. These are the skills that you see, but we're not assessing for them. So we don't value them. If we're not assessing them, we don't value them. But that's because they're hard to assess and they're unreliable. And exam boards need high reliability. They need it to be the same. Whatever child you have, the result is the same. So we decrease the validity, but we increase reliability. What I would argue is we need more valid assessment where we're looking at those really important skills and the really important understandings. And to do that, the obvious point is that examinations probably won't do it. And therefore, in some way, governments, systems, schools are going to have to trust teachers more. Trust the professionalism of teachers to get it right, because teachers are best placed to make those judgments about a learner's ability to master or not particular skills. So yeah, I think we're in one position, but I would love to see in the next 10 years that we move to another.
Yeah, and let's hope that's where we're going in many forms of education. And I think what you say about putting that, trust in teachers is important thing. Like we need to let it go of letting, trusting the students to own their learning. I think the same goes to also teachers to get
Absolutely.
that done. Yeah.
Yeah, they know the students best.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So takeaways. We love takeaways here. Can you think about one or tell us one takeaway that you would like the listeners or viewers to know about with your research and discoveries in the field of education? And this can be with research, international curriculum development. What is one takeaway you want us to know?
Well, you would think that with my background, I'm going to come out with something profound to say about interdisciplinary learning or concepts or skills. Well, no, because as much as I've spent the last gazillion years working in curriculum development, I think that curriculum development is a tiny part of the whole. The most important thing, and my takeaway is that the most important thing to work on is relationships. The relationship between teacher and student, there is nothing more important. Of course, relationships between teachers and between teachers and school leadership are very important, but it's that teacher-student relationship is the most important. That's what it comes down to. We need to work on them. You can have a motivating, stimulating curriculum. It does help. Of course it helps. That's about 10% of the whole, I think. What it comes down to is nurturing relationships. But we talked earlier about the fact that we think teachers should be able to have that freedom and trust to be able to build and create a curriculum like you often can't in national systems. But in the international world, we do have more, the teachers have more ability to be professional and to be creative. And I think this is where the relationship and the curriculum come together. If the teachers are able to design curriculum that takes into account the characteristics of the students in front of them, or the passions or the interests of the students in front of them, then that's what motivates. So I think if you've got a great relationship, you can better devise the curriculum that works for the class in front of you this year. And I think that's my takeaway. Knowing your students means that you will design the curriculum that better matches their passion. And what we want is passionate, intrinsically motivated learners.
And I love that you say not just relationships, nurturing relationships. I think that's exactly right. Having that caring, nurturing, knowing what makes a student tick and what makes them, roar and challenge them. And you can only get that by having a relationship and understanding, how a student can really grow, a learner.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, wonderful. Great. Well, thank you for that takeaway. Malcolm, I just want to say thank you very much for taking your time out today and for sharing your insight and all that travel that you've done around the world has brought you here. It's brought you to the next step, and we're so excited for your journey ahead. And we hope to hear from you again. And if there's anything I can say with what I've learned from you is that that relationships is super key, because that's what we're learning and what I'm learning as well as we're working on this this YouTube and podcast series. So
fantastic, and thank you very much for inviting me. I think this is a great idea, and if anyone's passing by Hyderabad, please pop in at Trinity International School. We'd be very happy to show you around our beautiful campus.
That sounds so wonderful. We might just take you up on that. Thank you very much,
Malcolm.
Malcolm.
Thanks a lot then.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.